Think medieval knights trained with honor and nobility? Dead wrong. 7-year-olds were ripped from families and systematically tortured into emotionless killing machines. Through beatings, psychological conditioning, and brutal competitions that would break modern soldiers. Training weapons heavier than real steel designed to splinter skin and crack skulls during daily combat until blood flowed freely. But when they became squires, the real nightmare began. What happened next? You think you know how knights trained? All that romantic stuff about noble lords practicing fancy sword fighting in castle courtyards? Well, hold on to your metal armor because the real story of medieval knight training was harsh and bloody. We're talking about a system so tough that most kids didn't even live to see their 15th birthday. I'm about to tell you the shocking truth about how these legendary warriors were actually made. From the twisted mind games used to break down children, to the savage training methods that would make modern military boot camps look like summer camp. The journey from farm boy to armored fighting machine. It all started with something called fostering. Noble families would actually trade their 7-year-old sons like farm animals, sending them to live with complete strangers. Why? Because your own parents might go easy on you. These strangers had no problem breaking you down completely and building you back up from nothing. These boys became pages, which sounds innocent enough until you learn what that actually meant. Pages weren't cute little servants running around castles. They were prisoners in a carefully planned mind experiment. Every part of their lives was controlled, watched, and changed to create the perfect warrior mindset. The first lesson wasn't about fighting at all. It was about handling pain. Pages would be beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as training. The thinking was twisted, but it worked. If you couldn't handle a beating from your master, how could you survive a battlefield where enemy weapons were trying to kill you? They called it toughening, but today we would see it as planned abuse designed to make kids emotionally numb. But here's where it gets really dark. These beatings weren't random. They were planned to break down the child's natural fear responses. Masters would study each page, finding their specific breaking points, then use them against the kids. Some boys cracked under the pressure and were sent home in shame. Others became empty shells, perfect for shaping into emotionless killers. The daily routine of a medieval page was built around one idea: strip away everything that made them human and rebuild them as weapons. They woke before sunrise, often in freezing cold stone rooms with no heat. Their first job was caring for their master's weapons and armor, not because it was simple work, but because they needed to develop an almost religious respect for the tools of war. While handling these weapons, pages learned their first important lesson about medieval combat. Weight. A full suit of armor weighed between 60 and 80 pounds. A knight's sword was usually 3 to 4 pounds. A war hammer could be 8 pounds or more. These weren't the lightweight fake weapons you see in movies. They were brutal, heavy tools designed to crush bones and tear through metal. Pages spent hours each day just carrying these weapons, building the specific muscles needed for combat, but not in the way you'd expect. They weren't doing medieval push-ups or lifting stones. Instead, they did something called burden training. Masters would load them down with heavier and heavier combinations of armor and weapons, then force them to do daily tasks. Imagine trying to serve dinner while wearing a 40-pound mail shirt and carrying a shield, or cleaning floors while balanced with a sword at your hip. This wasn't just strength training. It was teaching their bodies to work normally under combat loads. By the time they reached their teens, wearing armor felt as natural as modern clothes. But the physical training was nothing compared to the mind games. Pages lived in constant fear, not just of their masters, but of each other. The fostering system deliberately created competition between boys. Masters would pit pages against each other in brutal contests, rewarding the winners and punishing the losers. These weren't friendly competitions. Boys fought with wooden weapons that could easily break bones. They wrestled until someone was knocked unconscious. They competed in endurance challenges that pushed their bodies to the breaking point. The message was clear. Your fellow pages weren't your friends. They were obstacles to overcome. This competitive environment served two purposes. First, it identified natural leaders and fighters. But more importantly, it conditioned these future knights to see violence as normal, even necessary. By the time they graduated to squires, hurting others felt as natural as breathing. The training weapons deserve special attention because they show just how seriously medieval society took combat preparation. Forget those lightweight wooden swords you see in movies. Training weapons were often heavier than their real counterparts. Pages learned with wooden swords that weighed 6 or 7 pounds, nearly twice the weight of steel blades. Why make training harder than the real thing? Simple psychology. When you finally got to use a real sword in combat, it felt impossibly light and fast by comparison. Your strikes would be lightning quick because your muscles were used to moving much heavier weights. It's the same idea modern athletes use, but applied to medieval warfare. The wooden weapons weren't just heavy, they were designed to hurt. Training swords had rough edges that would leave splinters in your skin. Practice spears had blunt but solid tips that could still punch holes through leather armor. Wooden maces were basically clubs that could crack skulls if you weren't careful. Pages fought with these brutal training weapons daily, often until blood was drawn. Masters encouraged this because they believed pain was the greatest teacher. If you made a mistake in practice and got hurt, you'd remember that lesson when your life depended on it in real combat. But here's what really separates medieval training from modern military preparation. These weren't adults who had volunteered for service. These were children, some as young as 7, being systematically conditioned to kill without hesitation or guilt. The psychological techniques used were sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Masters used something we'd now recognize as classical conditioning. Every time a page successfully completed a violent task, they received rewards, food, praise, small privileges. But any sign of weakness or mercy was met with harsh punishment. Over time, the boys' brains literally rewired themselves to connect violence with positive outcomes and compassion with pain. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of careful manipulation to turn a normal child into someone who could charge into battle swinging an axe at another human being's head. But by the time these pages became squires around age 14, the process was nearly complete. They had learned to suppress natural human emotions like fear, empathy, and self-preservation. They developed the physical strength and endurance needed for armored combat. Most importantly, they'd internalized the warrior mindset that would define the rest of their lives. But we've only scratched the surface of this medieval training system. What happened when pages graduated to squires was even more intense, more dangerous, and more psychologically damaging. The real combat training hadn't even begun yet. At 14, everything changed. The boy you once were was gone forever, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Welcome to the squire years, where the real nightmare began. As a squire, you were no longer learning about violence, you were living it. Your new role was simple. Follow a fully trained knight everywhere he went, including into actual combat. No practice swords now, no wooden shields. Real steel, real blood, real death. The first shock was discovering that knights weren't the honorable heroes from the stories. They were professional killers who viewed warfare as a business transaction. Your knight might spend Monday morning butchering peasants in a village raid, then Tuesday afternoon discussing poetry with nobles at court. The ability to switch between brutal violence and civilized behavior wasn't considered unusual. It was expected. Your job as a squire was to keep your knight alive and effective in battle. This meant learning skills that would horrify modern people. You had to master the art of helping wounded knights continue fighting. Not healing them, mind you, just keeping them functional long enough to keep killing. You learned to quickly patch arrow wounds with whatever materials were available. Mud, cloth, even human hair could be used to stop bleeding temporarily. You discovered which injuries were immediately fatal and which ones a knight could fight through for a few more minutes. Most disturbingly, you learned when it was more efficient to finish off your own wounded allies rather than waste time trying to save them. The weapons training intensified beyond anything you'd experienced as a page. Squires didn't just learn to use swords and shields, they mastered every weapon that might appear on a medieval battlefield. Warhammers that could crush plate armor, crossbows that required 200 pounds of force to draw, pole axes designed specifically to punch through helmets and into the brains underneath. But the most important weapon wasn't made of steel. It was your horse. Medieval warfare was dominated by heavy cavalry, and learning to fight from horseback was like learning to pilot a fighter jet while someone shot arrows at your head. The physics alone were terrifying. A knight and horse charging at full speed created roughly 3,000 pounds of momentum. When that force hit an enemy line, bones didn't just break, they exploded. Training to fight on horseback meant learning to control your mount with your legs and body weight while your hands were busy with weapons. You practiced striking targets while galloping past them at 20 miles per hour. You learned to lean out of your saddle to deliver killing blows without falling off your horse. Most challenging of all, you mastered the lance. The lance wasn't just a long spear. It was a precisely engineered killing instrument that required perfect timing and body mechanics to use effectively. Get the angle wrong by a few degrees and you'd miss your target completely. Get your grip wrong and the impact would tear the weapon from your hands or break your arm. Get your balance wrong and you'd be thrown from your horse at full speed, probably dying from the fall alone. Squires practiced lance work using a device called the quintain. Picture a wooden post with a rotating crossbar. On one end hung a shield target, on the other end a heavy sandbag. You'd charge the target with your lance, trying to strike it dead center. Hit it properly and the crossbar would swing away from you. Miss or hit it wrong and the sandbag would swing around and knock you off your horse. It sounds almost comical until you realize that the sandbag weighed about as much as a fully armored knight. Getting hit by it at speed could break ribs, dislocate shoulders, or cause concussions. Squires were regularly injured during quintain training, some seriously enough to end their knightly careers before they'd even begun. But physical injuries were nothing compared to what happened to their minds. The constant exposure to violence was changing their brain chemistry in fundamental ways. Modern neuroscience tells us that repeated trauma literally rewires neural pathways, especially in developing brains. These teenage squires were experiencing levels of violence and stress that would cause severe PTSD in modern soldiers. Yet they weren't allowed to show weakness. Any sign of fear, hesitation, or emotional breakdown was met with brutal punishment. Knights believed that mercy was a luxury that got you killed on the battlefield. Better to break a squire's spirit completely than send him into combat with doubts that might cost both their lives. The psychological conditioning reached its peak during something called blooding. This was the moment when a squire killed another human being for the first time. It wasn't supposed to happen in a major battle where the squire might freeze up and get everyone killed. Instead, knights would arrange for their squires to participate in small raids or skirmishes where the outcome was already decided. The target might be a group of bandits, enemy messengers, or even just peasants from a rival lord's territory. The point wasn't military strategy, it was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Once you'd taken a human life, something inside you changed forever. The knights knew this and they used it as the final step in their psychological conditioning. After blooding, squires reported feeling emotionally numb, disconnected from their former selves. They described it as watching their own actions from outside their bodies, as if someone else was controlling their movements. Modern psychology recognizes this as dissociation, a common response to severe trauma. But medieval knights saw it as the birth of a true warrior. The final test came around age 21 when squires were eligible for knighthood. But this wasn't a ceremony or graduation. It was a brutal examination that many didn't survive. The candidate had to prove they could function effectively in actual combat, not just training exercises. This meant participating in a real military campaign, their performance would be closely watched by experienced knights. They had to demonstrate not just fighting skill, but the ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. Could they kill without hesitation? Could they follow orders even when those orders meant certain death for innocent people? Could they maintain discipline while watching their friends die around them? Those who passed became full knights, joining an elite brotherhood of professional warriors. But the cost was enormous. These men had been systematically stripped of normal human empathy and rebuilt as instruments of violence. They could no longer relate to ordinary people or live normal lives. War was all they knew, and war was all they were good for. The few records we have from former knights paint a disturbing picture of men haunted by what they'd become. Many struggled with what we now recognize as severe mental illness. They had nightmares, violent outbursts, and difficulty forming meaningful relationships. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the pain. Others simply withdrew from society entirely. So there's your reality check about medieval knight training. It wasn't romantic or noble. It was a systematic process of child abuse designed to create emotionally damaged killers. These weren't heroes from fairy tales. They were traumatized victims of a brutal system who then inflicted that same trauma on others. The next time you see a movie about brave knights riding off to save the day, remember what it really took to create those warriors. Remember the 7-year-old boys torn from their families and subjected to years of psychological and physical torture. Remember that behind every shining suit of armor was a broken human being who'd paid an unimaginable price for their fighting skills. Medieval knight training was effective at producing warriors, but at a cost that no civilized society should ever be willing to pay. Thank you for watching this episode of Middle Age Madness. If this opened your eyes to the darker side of medieval history, make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started. Remember that history is rarely as noble as the stories make it seem.